Joining us now, the one and only Briahna Joy Gray, host of the Bad Faith podcast and former National Press Secretary for Bernie Sanders. Great to see you, Bri.
Good to see you, Bri.
It's good to be back.
You've been hosting some of the most interesting conversations anywhere recently, and we want to dig in particular. You did a series of 2 different podcasts regarding the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. You kind of dug into some of the specifics of what exactly happened and the legal issues involved. And then you had a broader conversation about white supremacy and is the term overused and how does it apply throughout society and where does this concept come from with 2 people the Breaking Points community would be very familiar with, Army Osei Frimpong and Zed Jelani. First, Bri, if you could just set up for us, what was your inspiration for this conversation and what were you hoping to get at in this conversation?
So not just in the context of Kyle Rittenhouse, but in this broader context of the CRT battles that have been waged for about a year now, the question on everybody's lips is sort of, what is white supremacy, and is white supremacy being bandied about in a way that basically makes the term meaningless? Oftentimes in these conversations, people end up talking past each other, right? Because people who are more to the right, more conservative, see the left as being overzealous in their application of that term because they understand what white supremacy is very differently. And part of the whole battle around CRT is challenging a more structural understanding of how systems of race and oppression work in this country. And whether or not you agree that those systems of race and racism or oppression or hierarchies are real, for a lot of the population, calling those systems white supremacy feels like a bridge too far, given their understanding of white supremacy as being something more direct. You know, a guy in a KKK robe, someone saying you can't work here because you're Latino, et cetera. And so I wanted to unpack what we mean when we say these kinds of things so that we can have more grounded, realistic conversations that don't just end up with us talking past each other. And then also move on to this more substantive conversation of, given the confusion around these terms, and given the fact that even those who believe in systems and hierarchies of oppression are often misusing or differently applying the term white supremacy, how useful is this term? If everything is white supremacy, how useful is it to use a term that is so confusing and misleading and difficult to understand by a bulk of the population that you're actually trying to reach?
Yeah, I think it's been so valuable what you've been doing. You've been getting a lot of attention, and I'll tell the right-leaning listeners here, you've had on a lot of people who are very dissident necessarily from mainstream left thought, and you've totally heard them out. Andrew Sullivan and many others, and I think that's why, despite the bad faith name, probably the best faith conversation.
Very true.
I want to give
it's
people,
ironic.
I know.
It's always ironic.
Let's give people a taste here of the clip. Let's go ahead and take a listen.
So Kyle Rittenhouse, he's not a Bond villain, right? Like, he's an indeterminate joiner. He just kind of joined the team that made him feel like the most relevant, right? So it's kind of what Hannah Arendt said about Eichmann. The same, like, these bad guys are not particularly bad. They're just participating in a bad structure. Like, it was like I was watching Ralph from The Simpsons on trial. This guy is not some sort of like super villain. But yet it takes a series of institutions actually before you actually find this guy across state lines with a large weapon shooting people. Like, we have to talk about the families that produced him, the schools that failed to produce him. He's a social failure. And at 17 years old, he's a youth. And we say that youths are not actually responsible for what they do. What they do is actually a reflection of who their minders are. So like, it's a reflection of us, right? So we need to actually do a real autopsy into all of the cultural institutions that created that moment.
What did you make of that moment, Briahna? And what was Zed's response to that? Because I know some of the tension between Irami and Zed was Irami wanted to say, this is connected to what happened in El Paso. This is connected to what happened with those massage parlor shootings. They all come out of these cultural institutions that was saying, wait. You can't just paint with a broad brush like that. So what did you make of those exchanges?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to misrepresent Irami, so people should feel free to go and listen to the full episode. But the case he was basically making that there is something wrong with quote unquote white culture. And while we often hear, especially from the right, Black culture described in these terms, there's often questions about, where is the father? Where is the 2-parent household? These kinds of conversations that often I think detach us from having a substantive policy conversation about how to actually enrich the communities and make life better for human beings, working people. Irony is basically saying there's a white cultural problem here as well, and you can see it tethered through all of these different kinds of events and the rise of certain kinds of hate crimes and violence from this particular community over the last 4 or 5 years. Now, Zed objected, saying basically that it's as inappropriate to make that kind of broader white cultural leap as it is to say the same thing about a broad Black culture when cultures are so diverse and diffuse regionally, ethnically, and among kind of racial groups, we can have a conversation about, the socially constructed nature of race, et cetera. But that is inappropriate to do so. And my addition to the conversation was that there's this theory by these women, the Field sisters, professors, both of them, who wrote this book called Racecraft. And I asked whether talking about whiteness, white people this way ends up shoring up a kind of racial identity that is less productive, less healthy, and ultimately perhaps feeds into a kind of politics that I don't subscribe to, instead of letting people identify by their regions or their cultural backgrounds, Irish, Italian, Jewish, et cetera. And that creating whiteness by talking about whiteness in this way is ultimately exactly what white supremacists are angling for.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I just want to say, I tweeted, Joe Rogan had Snoop Dogg on his podcast, and Joe said something where he said, if they can keep us divided by race and nationality, then they won't have us talking about class. I'm paraphrasing him a little bit, but that's the gist of what he said. And what I loved about it is it was getting attacked from identitarian lefts and also far-right white supremacists who were like, well, if we're divided by race and nationality, like maybe that's what just actually divides us. Something. Right. And it was like a strange horseshoe on that. I'm curious, you have been delving into this now. This is a series and a conversations, very difficult ones, especially I think for somebody who occupies the ideological lane that you do to have. How have you found the reception to this, Briahna, in pushing for the type of politics? I actually think there's a lot of commonality here on the screen.
Yeah, well, the thing is, you have to take what the response is on Twitter and the response on YouTube and the response in real life. Those are all 3 very different audiences and 3 very different things. I've gotten a lot of personal feedback, but there's a lot of folks in the world who feel this way, right? And there are shades and gradations here, but I think what's really helpful to people and what gives me some leeway here is that I am also coming to terms with what I think about these things kind of live on air, right? I'm working through issues in a really sincere way. There are things that Zed said that I absolutely agree with. I'm more inclined with him to think that talking about whiteness and white cultural deficits is not productive and is frankly inaccurate. But I also understand what Iremy is saying about there being something more than just a gun violence problem in America, right? That there are these cultural, localized trends that emerge and that have something to do, I think, less with cultural whiteness, but with broad precarity, status threat, the white decline, the opioid crisis, all of these things that we know are going on, but are so infrequently brought into the conversation. And as moments of tragedy continue to erupt over the country, whether they're around protests, whether they're around these kind of political moments like 1/6, we're going to be really challenged to come up with a concrete and consistent way to measure our response to things that's not so polarizing and ideologically driven. And I think starting now and being able to say, look, Kyle Rittenhouse has been embraced by some of the worst toxic elements in the country. He's also a 17-year-old kid. And if we're leftists who have this kind of abolitionist framework that understands that we don't want to be locking up children in particular, and that people are products of their environment, then we have to figure out how to talk about this that doesn't minimize the broader cultural trends and what people are making of this, at the same time that we don't try to make a martyr out of someone who doesn't necessarily fit the mold of our cultural expectations in this moment.
So there was another moment that we pulled of some of Iremy's commentary that kind of gets at some of these questions because Iremy, and again, like you, I don't want to mischaracterize his comments. We're going to put the link down in the description box so you guys can subscribe and you can watch this episode. And I highly recommend that all of you do that because these conversations have been extraordinarily enlightening. But he's getting at this idea. He believes kind of the core problem is white culture. And that a focus on material conditions, things like healthcare, things like potential UBI or a federal jobs guarantee, et cetera, that you're kind of missing what he sees as the main problem, which is related to but not exclusively about these material conditions. Let's take a listen to a little bit of what he had to say there.
There's going to be a problem with me and a lot of left politics, because I do think, like, in a deep way, if like a vaguely ethno-fascist government politician like supported universal health care, the left wouldn't really have the arguments to fight against it.
Agreed.
And that's a problem, right? that is a problem. And so, like, the idea that we're okay with a racial hierarchy as long as it delivers goodies and it seems to work in such a way that is short of self-governance and self-determination, and might be a little bit high on like coddling racial anxiety of the whites, as long as it delivers goodies, is a form of white supremacy. And I think that's like a large part of the left.
And you're saying that's where we already are, basically. The goodies aren't great, but that's kind of the status quo we're in already.
The question is, and the people who want to get out of that status quo want more goodies by catering to white culture as it is, as opposed to, I'm saying that like we might need to like downgrade the goodies and go full board on changing the whites.
Well, I would object to the...
So part of what I found interesting there is that you agreed with him about the initial comment about, I think a lot of the left would be good with an ethno-fascist as long as they gave out universal health care. What did you think of his comments there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to the reality that people are in a vice grip. People feel desperate, and they would make a lot of trade-offs. They continue to make trade-offs. They've already made trade-offs, to my point, right? Joe Biden is Jim Crow Joe. He was the author of the crime bill, and yet the overwhelming majorities of Black Americans lined up and voted for him because the alternative seemed worse. And we've been caught in that kind of vice grip, right? The goodies right now are simply not Trump. I mean, that's how low the bar has gotten, right? But what I disagree with Irony about is this notion that whiteness, in quotation marks, is the best offer you can give to people, or that is necessarily at the top of their priority list, of white voters' priority list. Since the beginning of this country, we have an upcoming episode with Ben Jealous, the youngest ever president of the NAACP, who walks through a little bit of this early American history, where part of the reason that we had racial codes, race was codified in the way that it was, that set rules about the progeny of mixed race couplings being Black, and making sure that people understood that there was a consequence to being Black and aligning with Blackness. It's because some of the earliest kind of revolutionary moments in this country were white indentured servants and Black slaves coming together to resist authority, right? To resist their oppressors, the people who literally, frankly, owned and directed their entire lives. And that by creating racial division, you can break up very natural coalitions. And that has been a pattern over the course of American history, Bacon's Rebellion, Blair Mountain, et cetera, on and on and on. And so I resist Ireme's what I think of as a kind of essentialized view of the matter, which says no matter what, the only thing that you can offer to white people that will work is necessarily racism. It is coddling whites. It is giving up something you shouldn't be giving up. It is throwing people of color and other marginalized groups under the bus. When, in my view, history shows us that offering basic populist programs that enrich people's lives is more attractive than offering racism. It's just what has happened is that it is very infrequently offered, and we don't have very many test cases for what happens when someone like an elected Democrat like Joe Biden or Barack Obama actually follows through with their populist campaign promises.
Yeah. I think you really are having some of the most important conversations. We really appreciate it. That's why I wanted to highlight it here. I hope everybody subscribes and supports your work. It's really important. So we'll have the link down there in the description. Thank you, Briahna.
Thanks, Bri.
Really
Great to see you, and happy Thanksgiving.
Great to see you both. Happy Thanksgiving.
Absolutely. Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you guys so much for watching. We really appreciate it. We're not going to have a full show for you on Thanksgiving, but we will have a lot of extra content, which we've worked on here on the show. As Krystal said in her monologue, spend some time with your family. Just don't talk about politics. Just relax. Really unplug. Take a time to appreciate, everything that you might have or maybe have lost. It's a time for everything. That's what Thanksgiving actually should be all about. And for those of you who have supported us now over the last couple of months, it just absolutely means the world. It's going to be something that I'm thankful for. Really,
100%.
Yesterday when we talked about YouTube and coming and demonetizing our segment on Peng Shuai. I mean, the amount of support that we've heard from you guys is just amazing. Today we covered Jeffrey Epstein. Guarantee you that one's going to get demonetized. Today we covered Waukesha. Guarantee you that one's probably going to get age restricted or whatever. But what we take our responsibility as is to show you the news unvarnished in the best possible way that we can. And sometimes that means going afoul of YouTube. So if you can help us out, we deeply appreciate it.
Yep.
Thank you guys so much.
You guys have allowed us to do that, and for that we are extraordinarily grateful. So have a beautiful week. We will be posting some content throughout the week and a number of things on Thanksgiving as well, if that's how you want to spend some of your time. But most importantly, enjoy your friends and your family, and we will see you back here next week.
See you next week.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.